Hi friends, as we step into the summer season, our ministers' messages continue their focus on spiritual practice, hopefully deepening our understanding and engagement with spiritual practice. When you and I think about people who are engaged in medical practice, or legal practice, or even architectural practices, that word practice is used in a manner that goes beyond its everyday meaning. Someone who is engaged in medical practice is engaged in something that goes beyond simple behavior or certain habits. A practice is a practice because it's embedded in certain values and narratives and certain orientation that are critical to making it a legal practice, a medical practice, and so on. A practice is a practice because it is a coherent and complex set of activities and values, often pursued in community of others who understand that there are intrinsic goods and intrinsic values that make a medical practice a medical practice. More than 20 years ago, theologian Craig Dykstra was interested in spiritual practices. We've been talking about how the church building may be closed, but the church itself has never been closed because the church is anchored in spiritual practices. So theologian Craig Dykstra tried to identify what are some of the common features, what are some of the qualities that make something a spiritual practice. One of the criteria or qualities of a spiritual practice for Dykstra was that it wasn't just an activity that would then bring on something spiritual. A spiritual practice is a practice because it is itself a form of participating in the holy and in the sacred. And that in participating in what was holy and sacred, it was speaking to a fundamental human need, an existential need that constitutes our life as a human life. Another feature of what makes something a spiritual practice was that it named identity-shaping beliefs and values and narratives and dispositions that constitute our spiritual practice as fundamental to the life of faith. These were not just things that you and I go about doing, simple activities, but they brought with them values and dispositions, meanings from the life of faith. Dykstra also understood that a spiritual practice is a practice because it heals the separation between our knowing and our doing. A spiritual practice is a practice because it integrates the life of contemplation and the life of action. A spiritual practice is a practice because it can focus on something very particular and specific. And yet at the same time, a spiritual practice was malleable and creative enough to speak to various dimensions of our life. So you and I can focus on the spiritual practice of hospitality, and yet we can begin to understand hospitality in making policy, or in looking at hospitality in our own way of bringing neighbors into our home, or hospitality as it might be embedded in our Sunday worship's liturgy, or the way that hospitality is so foundational to our anti-racist and multicultural work of inviting the other through our form of radical hospitality. So in this way, Craig Dykstra saw how a specific form of spiritual practice was both particular and specific, and yet it was able to connect through various ways in which our social life is so compartmentalized and fragmented today. A spiritual practice is a spiritual practice because maybe more important than any other feature, it is not a privatized activity, but spiritual practice that is necessarily grounded in belonging across the generations. That a spiritual practice is grounded in the narratives of a faith tradition that spans more than a single generation. And a spiritual practice that brings with it its imbued wisdom that has been collected over generations. And so a spiritual practice is a spiritual practice because it is not something that any one of us does on our own, individualized, autonomous. Even when we practice something at home, it connects in our heart and in our spiritual imagination. It connects us to the communities of faith who have been practicing prayer and meditation, who have been practicing generosity and patience across time and culture. So a spiritual practice is a practice because we practice it together. We can adjust and amend these malleable forms for particular contexts, for particular moments, and yet a spiritual practice grounds us in community across time and space. A spiritual practice is perhaps finally a spiritual practice because it is not a task or even a duty. It is ultimately a gift and a means of grace. And therefore, a spiritual practice has nothing to do with mastery. A spiritual practice works upon us, granting us an openness and a responsiveness to the sacred mystery of which we are a part. And so, friends, together we step ever more deeply into spiritual practices in this coming summer season.